Hello, welcome to Shad Life, where I have over 40 years of BMX and mountain biking experience, and I like to share all the information I have in my brain here with you awesome people. Today we're going to talk about geometry. I'm going to take a little different approach because I've talked a lot about geometry, but hopefully this one's a little more concise. I'm going to have pictures of me on the bike and show you why these things matter. So we're going to start with A. We're going to just go through the letters in order. A is effective top tube. This is center of head tube to center of seat tube, or if you have your seat post up here, center of your seat post, right? That's basically going to determine where your saddle is in relationship to where your handlebars are, right? Depending on small adjustments you make up here in the front end. Here I am seated on the bike. So right in here, if you follow my little red pointer to about here is that effective top tube measurement. That's going to determine kind of where my hips are centered, right? And how much lean I have forward, the angle of my back, so on and so forth, and the comfort of my arms, and also going to determine how much weight distribution I have between my seat and my hands on the grips, right? If you have too much weight on the seat, you tend to get a little sore and uncomfortable. If you have too much weight on the hands, you tend to get numb hands and things like that, or your arms get tired quicker. So the seated position is really important for comfort and just for, longevity and so on and so forth in your ride. All right, so let's talk about the measurement that's important when you're standing. So while you're standing, B, which is reach, is the more important measurement. So this is center of bottom bracket. So your cranks go in the bottom bracket. This is going to be where your feet are on the pedals, right? To your center of head tube. So it's a shorter measurement. And when you're standing, you're going to be up over the bottom bracket, not way back here where your seat is. So this is the standing position right here. Notice, I'm a little more lean forward. Pedals are level. So I call this the ideal attack position. This is the position you want to be in when you're going to go ride anything technical. You don't want to be seated on your bike. You want to be out of the saddle and in this position. The reach number, which is from here to approximately where this dot is, so from the head tube to here to center of bottom bracket, is what's considered reach. And that's really going to determine how your body is positioned while you're standing. So very important. It wasn't that long ago that bikes were never really designed, or if they didn't really think about your standing position. It was all about your seated position. And so it's really important. More modern bikes, especially over the last 6-7 years, have been evolving to being set up in much better scenario for a standing position. Older bikes, if you go back just 10 years or so, or even further back than that, they would have a longer stem on them, a shorter frame, and your body center of mass would be more forward over the front wheel. That's not ideal for jumping, for riding down steep descents, things like that, because you're more towards the front of the bike and front end heavy while standing. So this is a really important number, is this reach number, and it's the reason why bikes have been getting longer frames, longer in here, and shorter stems, is they're pushing the frame, the front wheel, all of that out there, and they're bringing the handlebars back, and so you're still in that kind of same position you would have been years ago, but the front wheel is out more in front of you. So very important. So those two numbers are really going to determine how your bike fits you. And I say numbers meaning the actual measurement. Obviously, there are letters here that are designating effective top tube and reach. So let's get into the other measurements that are really going to kind of matter about how the bike rides. So this is more about how it's going to fit and how you're positioned on it. Most of these other things are going to matter how your bike rides. So if we talk about C is just going to be the wheelbase. I don't put a lot of emphasis on wheelbase because wheelbase is going to become just a natural number based on all these other measurements of the bike. Head tube angle, chainstay length, all of that is going to end up creating the wheelbase of the bike. So not too much focus on wheelbase. So let's just move right to D, which is chainstay length, right? So that's center of bottom bracket to center of rear axle, parallel to the ground, of course. Don't follow the frame too, because there's all different kinds of frame designs. We just follow always parallel to the ground. And so that measurement there is going to determine how much easier the front end is going to pull up, or how planted the front end is going to be. The longer the bottom, or sorry, not bottom bracket, the longer the chain stay, right? If your axle's way back here, it's going to make the front end harder to come up. Better for climbing, but not as ideal for like going off jumps or through technical things. The shorter chain stay makes the front end easier to come up, but then if you're climbing, the front end will want to come up easier. And we'll talk about F here in a minute, but it is the reason why seat tube angles have gotten a little steeper. And we'll go back to my seated diagram and I'll talk about that in a second here. But chainstay length really does, determine kind of how poppy or how a bike really handles as far as like being able to come off of jumps, bunny hop, pull up to get over technical things if you're going over rock piles or log piles and things like that. And so it's a really important number. Okay, so since we just talked about chainstay length, another measurement that's really important in relationship to all of this is BB drop, and it's not shown here. We'll just consider it E since E is missing. So center of rear axle to center of front axle, if you draw a line, so you can just take this line here, make an imaginary line all the way to here intersecting this line, then BB drop will be the measurement between here and the center of the bottom bracket. So how much does the bottom bracket drop between the axles? That is an important number. It's going to determine some of the handling characteristics of the bike. I talked about chainstay affecting pop. Shorter chainstay makes more pop. Raising the bottom bracket also creates more pop. And by pop, I mean easier for the front end to come up and easier to like bunny hop, or makes the bike more controllable by the rider. Lowering the BB drop creates more stability. So there's kind of a balance between how much drop you want. If you make the BB drop really low, you can make a bike really stable, right? And BB drop and chainstay length can be worked together to kind of accomplish that ideal feel that the manufacturer wants. But one thing we always have to caution with BB drop. If you see me here, I have my pedal in the down position, and that'll determine how much ground clearance I have with the pedal. If your bottom bracket's lower, then your pedal is closer to the ground and has a higher risk of hitting rocks and things like that. You can adjust that by having shorter crank arms, but then that can affect how much power and leverage you have. And there's a lot of debate out there about crank arm length also, but we won't get into that in this video. But just keep in mind, lower BB means your pedals are closer to the ground. So even though it creates more stability, it can cause side effects trying to gain that stability. So it's important, and if you want a bike to be more poppy and you like to jump, pull up the front end to get over things, you don't want a super low BB. You want one that's maybe a little bit higher, and you want a little bit shorter chainstay too, which gives you a much more, agile and poppy bike. Now we're going to start to get into the degree angle of the seat tube. That is F here. That is going to help change effective top tube. So A and F are going to work together. And so if this is slacker, it's going to extend and make the effective top tube longer. If it's steeper, it's going to shorten the effective top tube. A whole lot going on here with this measurement, and it's kind of important. Lately, I've seen this trend of making really steep seat tubes on some of these more aggressive bikes, like enduro bikes and things like that. And the reason for that is they're trying to get the rider forward more, and that helps keep the front end down while climbing. So it does help aid in climbing, having a steeper seat tube angle. But let's take a look at me on the bike here. Okay, so one of the things you want to be careful of is if you start moving my hips forward as a steeper seat angle would do, you're going to move my knee forward while I'm seated. And my knee, you ideally kind of want the knee to be over your laces or over your pedal spindle when seated, and your pedal forward like this, because that is kind of the ideal position and the comfort position of your joints while your legs are going around and around, right? If you start bringing your knee way forward of your pedal axle, then you might start having discomfort. One of the reasons why on an enduro bike, when you make a steeper seat angle, it's not as important as you're not going super long distances on these bikes. They're generally designed to climb and get up to the top of the hill so you can turn around and bomb down the hill. Enduro racing is exactly that. They time you on the downhills, and then you have to climb and get back up to the top, and then they time you on the next downhill run, and then you climb and get right, so you can take your time and so on and so forth getting up to the top. So enduro bikes, they're steepening the seat angles for that. But if you're more into long distance riding and you ride 15, 20, 30 miles on a ride, a lot of seated pedaling, you don't want a super steep seat angle and getting your knee and your legs out of position and getting your hips too far over the bottom bracket. So keep that in mind. I know it's pretty trendy to have a super steep seat angle. It's not necessarily always ideal for your body position and the mechanics of your body. So a very important number here, seat tube angle. It's kind of one of those more ignored things on bikes, but it's actually pretty important. G, we're not going to talk a ton about. That's the seat tube length. It does change on a frame like this anyway, which is actually the same as the Esker Hey Duke that I'm on in the picture. So this would determine kind of the standover when you're off the bike and your feet are flat on the ground. But so many more bikes nowadays, they're having lower standovers, mostly so you have room for a dropper post. So you're going to expect G to be a lower number nowadays, and you're going to want to be able to have pretty good range in your dropper post up here. So this is kind of old school. They used to size bikes this way, but now we're sizing bikes more by A and B, which is effective top tube and reach, more than you want to size by the height of the seat tube. So old school, not really going to care about that number. We're going to jump right over to, I want to talk about H because we just talked about seat tube angle. So let's talk about head tube angle, right? This is going to determine how your bike steers. So the steeper the head tube angle, the quicker handling your bike's going to be. And the shallower or slacker, as people like to say, head tube angle is going to make your bike more stable. This is kind of one of those things I talk about quite a bit because I'm not a big fan of this trend of all these bikes coming with super slack head angles. When I see bikes that are like 63 degrees, 64, 65-degree head angles, I consider that very slack. Basically, if you're pointed downhill, that's what you want. But for all other aspects of riding, that slack head angle actually is more does more harm than good. So I'm a fan of head angles somewhere between 66, 67, 68 degrees for pretty much 85-90% of the mountain biking out there, because you're mostly riding level ground, some climbing, tighter turns, even the flow trail, things like that. And you want that kind of quicker, snappier handling. You don't want it too snappy. It wasn't that long ago that 70 degrees, 72 degrees was normal. That is definitely too twitchy, but I feel like 66, 67, 68 is kind of that sweet spot, like the perfect place, because it's slack enough to make the bike handle really good downhill, but steep enough to make the bike still agile for tighter, slower speed riding. And by slower speed, I mean speed somewhere between 5 miles per hour and 15 miles per hour, right? Which is the large majority of the speeds you're going to be going on a mountain bike. It's very rare, unless you're doing exclusively downhill, that you're going to be pointing downhill and doing 25, 30, 35 miles per hour. If you're doing those kinds of speeds downhill over rugged terrain, you definitely want that super slack head angle. So just keeping that in mind. H is one of those things I talk about all the time. I don't like that the bike industry is treating all bikes as if they're downhill bikes, and so that's why I pick on that all the time. It's interesting on this diagram that they're measuring the height of the head tube. This is going to affect stack height. There's a few things that affect stack height, and K is also part of this. K is the length of the fork, axle to crown, and then I is the head tube. This is going to determine what's called stack height, and stack height isn't shown here, but if you go from center of the bottom bracket up to where this A comes to the top of the head tube, right there, that intersection to the bottom bracket is the stack height. That's going to determine this position here, right? So it's going to basically determine how tall is the front end in relationship to the bottom bracket. So here's where my cranks are, my feet are planted, standing, soft knees, nice kind of about 45-degree angle back, pretty good body position here while standing. If the stack height was taller, that would bring my shoulders back more. Stack height is also going to affect my body position while seated. If this was taller, it's going to bring me more upright on the bike. So what really is going to determine stack height is a combination of things. Usually it's suspension travel and the length of the head tube are the big factors. So longer travel forks is going to bring this up, and that's going to bring the front of the frame up, which is going to raise the stack height. So one of the most important things to know is a lot of people want to put like longer travel forks than what came on their bike, but you really want to stick within that range that the manufacturer suggests for the frame. And the reason for that is because they designed all these geometry numbers around a certain axle to crown or kind of length of fork. And so if you raise that, you're going to slacken the head angle, raise the bottom bracket, and change all the numbers on this geometry chart that you don't really want to do. If you lower it from where it's at, you're going to steepen everything and make the geometry numbers change. So you really want to stick within the range that the manufacturer suggests. And that's why these two numbers are important. So axle to crown and head tube length, right? This up here is going to be your axle offset, or fork offset is what it's called. That's essentially the offset right here between the axle and the center of the fork where it steers, right? And it's actually, if you measure it, it's going to come from the center of the head tube, not from the fork leg. It's going to be center of head tube coming down to where that axle is, because offset can also be built into the crown of the fork. They could literally have the axles in line with the fork blades and then bring this crown way forward to create the same effect, right? So there's just different ways of doing that. So you want to make sure when you talk about offset, it's in relationship to the steer tube coming down and the axle offset from that line. That's going to determine all kinds of handling characteristics in the front end. I'm going to do a video on that and head tube angle and all of this stuff separately, because it's a lot to bring into this video right here, because there's a ton of information there, and all of this stuff plays a role in kind of how the bike steers and handles and things like that. But it's pretty complicated. Just trust that the manufacturers generally know what they're doing when they tell you what fork offset you should have with the frame. So I wanted to show you this final picture here. There's a lot to take in on something like this. Is that reach number, the bottom bracket height, chainstay length, all of that are going to affect my ability to be able to get my weight back over the rear axle. So if this is the, like, if you go from the attack position into this position, this is like to do manuals, to pull up the front wheel, things like that. So you want to be able to easily be able to get your body back like this without a lot of effort. And so if I had too long of a stem on here, the front of the bike was too long or something like that, I wouldn't be able to really get my weight back where it needs to be, which is kind of centered over the rear axle here, right? So you want to make sure that you can do this and not have your arms locked out. They look pretty straight here, but I do have a slight bend in my elbows, soft knees, things like that. I don't have to do like extreme body position things in order to get my weight back here. I can just simply, push back some and get it there. So this is an important thing to be able to do on your bike if you're going to be doing any kind of technical riding, jumping, things like that. So there you have it. These numbers actually do matter. So let's think of it as A and B are more about the fit of the bike, right? How does the bike fit you? And then all these other numbers are going to be, how does the bike ride? And you're gonna want different measurements for different riding styles and riding type, things like that. A cross-country bike, you might want longer chain stays. You might want a lower stack height, things like that, because you're going to want to be more lower in that racing position. You're going fast, things like that. Cross-country bikes are getting more aggressive, though, because the courses are getting more technical. So that is kind of changing. But in general, that's what you want. And then as we start to move through all the different types of bikes, trail bikes, they're getting more aggressive. Everything's getting more aggressive these days. And then enduro bikes, things like that. Then you're going to start getting into shorter chain stays. You're going to get into slacker head tube angles, things like that. So these things matter, and hopefully this helps you understand geometry a little better and maybe what you would be looking for when purchasing a bike, or updating the one you have, things like that. So hopefully this information is helpful to you. That's why I'm putting it out there. I really appreciate your support from my channel. If you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. Peace.